Tonight, a tense back and forth as President Trump lashes out against Governor Kemp in a live interview with Fox News.
They had electoral officials making deals, like this character in Georgia who's a disaster, and the governor's done nothing. He's done absolutely nothing. I'm ashamed that I endorsed him.
Well, the attacks continued this morning when President Trump called Governor Kemp hapless in a tweet, and he said he should use emergency powers to overrule the Secretary of State and do signature matching on envelopes. State election officials have been the targets of President Trump's barbs and anger for weeks now, after both election night results and a statewide audit showed President-elect Biden won Georgia by nearly 13,000 votes. Today, Governor Kemp responded with this statement. Georgia law prohibits the governor from interfering in elections. The Secretary of State, who is an elected constitutional officer, has oversight over elections that cannot be overridden by executive order. As the governor has said repeatedly, he will continue to follow the law and encourage the Secretary of State to take reasonable steps, including a sample audit of signatures, to restore trust and address serious issues that have been raised. Joining me right now, 11 Alive legal analyst Paige Pate. Paige, glad to have you aboard here. There are those claims of being thrown around here about emergency powers as they relate to elections. Sort it out for us. Can the governor step in and order Secretary of State Raffensperger to do signature matching as the president claims?
Jeff, the simple answer to that is no, he cannot. The governor does not have any so-called emergency powers that have anything to do with the certification of the results of the election. Under Georgia law, the Secretary of State is the only official who is authorized to certify those results once he receives them from the county. So at this point, the governor has signed off on the Secretary of State certification, but has no authority whatsoever to step in and undo that, change it, or order some sort of a recount or audit. Has no authority.
So, Paige, correct me if I'm wrong here. Signature matching in this election has already occurred, correct?
That's correct to a certain extent. I think what the president is referring to, and perhaps Governor Kemp as well, is doing another audit of the actual envelopes of the absentee ballots or the mail-in ballots that were sent in. Of course, that comparison was made at the time those ballots were received. And the lawsuit relating to the voting machines also doesn't raise any new issue, because those machines printed out a paper copy of the ballot, which of course has been gone over by hand now a second time after the election. So there's no new ground here. Everything that could be checked has been checked.
I'm going to use a rural analogy here. Has the horse left the barn on this issue?
The horse has left the barn and has already done a circle around the track. There is nothing to do here from the governor's standpoint, other than what he did. Now, obviously, he's in a tough situation politically. He doesn't want to oppose the president, I don't think. So he suggested that the Secretary of State maybe should look closely at some signature matching issue, but he has no authority to order anything and no set of emergency powers to step in.
There's nothing worse than a highfalutin attorney and a news anchor using analogies about barns and animals.
And horses, you're right. That's very
All right, Paige. Thanks. We appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Jeff.